Hello all and welcome back to my channel. Thanks again so much for tuning in. I've got the part 2 picks for week 9 of the 2022 college football season ready to go. Before we get to that though, let's review what happened last week for week 8. There were 12 picks on the week last Saturday and I got 10 of them correct. I went 10-2 on the week for an overall record now of 94-18, which means I'm only 6 picks away from getting 100 picks correct this season. We'll see if I can do that with this set of picks. I went 4-1 in my top 25 picks, which makes me 17-5 over the year on those picks. And I went 1-0 in my top 10 picks, calling correctly Oregon beating UCLA. So I'm 4-0 in my top 10 picks. That's pretty dang good. I put the part 1 picks up on my YouTube channel last night, and I correctly called both of those games. I got Utah over Washington State, and I got NC State over Virginia Tech. So that actually gets me to 96-18 now in my picks. So I only need 4 correct picks out of the remaining 16 to get to 100. I'm pretty confident that I'm going to get there this week. So let's dive right into it with the picks for week 9 of the 2022 college football season. We are going to start with the number 1 team in the nation, the Georgia Bulldogs. They are 7-0. They are in Jacksonville for a neutral site game, as they are every year against Florida. Georgia is a very good team this year. Their offense looks very good under Stetson Bennett IV. Their defense looks just about as strong as their defense from last year looked. They had one bump in the road, and that was a game against Missouri on the road where they didn't lead until about 4 minutes to go in that game. But they did win that game, and they've looked pretty good in the games since. Florida, meanwhile, after that opening week win against Utah, has struggled a bit the rest of this season. I think Georgia is just too good. I think Georgia is just too strong, both offensively and defensively for Florida. I'm going to go with Georgia to move to 8-0 and win that game in Jacksonville. The number 2 team in the nation, the Ohio State Buckeyes, they are on the road against the number 13 team in the nation, the Penn State Nittany Lions. According to the stats, Ohio State is clearly the better team. They're better at running the ball than Penn State. They're better at run defense than Penn State. They're better at passing the ball than Penn State. And they're better at stopping the pass than is Penn State. Penn State rebounded nicely last week against Minnesota at home after that absolute drubbing they took at the hands of the University of Michigan's running game. I don't think Ohio State's going to rack up 400 rushing yards against Penn State. And despite the fact that this game is in Happy Valley with a crowd that is probably going to be quite vocal, I just think that it's not just the stats, it's also the eye test. Ohio State put up 50 on Iowa at home last week in a game where they played a pretty crappy first half. Imagine what that team is able to do if they can actually put together a good 60 minutes of football. Joel Klatt pointed this out in his YouTube show. They hung 50 on Iowa after only scoring a handful of points in the first half. The second half, they just exploded in that game. I do not think Penn State is going to put up much of a fight against Ohio State. I think Ohio State, even with the nagging injury to wide receiver Jackson Smith-Njigba, other wide receivers like Marvin Harrison Jr. have filled in splendidly for him. I just don't see Penn State having the defense to stop and slow down Ohio State's offense. I think Ohio State is too good offensively. I think Penn State has some issues defensively, as they showed against Michigan a couple of weeks ago. Although, as I said, I don't think Ohio State's going to rack up 400 rushing yards. I wouldn't be surprised if they racked up a few hundred passing yards on them and won this game. I'm going to go with Ohio State in this matchup to go to 8-0 on the season. And it really kind of feels like in the Big Ten, especially the Big Ten East, it feels like everyone's just kind of going through the motions, waiting for the matchup at the end of the year between Ohio State and Michigan. It really just feels that way. It feels like we're just inevitably marching towards an undefeated Michigan on the road against an undefeated Ohio State, and whoever wins that matchup will go on to the Big Ten championship game. Will probably win the Big Ten championship game and secure their spot in the college football playoff later this year. just as a quick aside, speaking of the college football playoff, the first playoff rankings come out next Tuesday, November 1st. So we'll be switching from the AP rankings for the next picks to the College Football Playoff Committee rankings for next week's picks. And it'll be interesting to see where they have everyone after this week's set of games. But Ohio State's going to win that game. Go with the Buckeyes. The number 3 team in the nation, the Tennessee Volunteers, they are home this week against the number 19 team in the nation, the Kentucky Wildcats. In terms of the stats, Kentucky is not as good as Tennessee when it comes to rushing the ball. Their rush defense isn't as good as Tennessee's. They're not as good at passing the ball as Tennessee is by far, but they are better at stopping the pass than Tennessee is. If Tennessee does have a weakness, it's the pass yards per game that they let up. Their passing defense doesn't seem to be that strong. A lot of the average that I use when I'm doing my statistical research here for Tennessee is going to be because Alabama put up big numbers on them a couple of weeks ago. But even before then, Tennessee's pass defense was not super strong. I think if this Tennessee defense does have a weakness going forward that teams like Georgia could take advantage of, it's going to be their pass defense. Their run defense is stout. Their running game is pretty good. Their passing game is very good. It's the pass defense that is the weak point on this Tennessee team. However, unfortunately for Kentucky, I do not think they have the passing attack, only passing for 260 yards a game, to take advantage of that pass defense. I think Tennessee's offense is too strong for Kentucky. I don't think Kentucky will be able to keep up with them. Kentucky's quarterback, Will Levis, is a good quarterback, and I like him. He can run the ball well. He can throw the ball pretty decently. I just don't think he's got the goods on the outside, the weapons on the outside, to be able to keep up with what Tennessee's quarterback, Hendon Hooker, and that offense can do. Having said all that, I think Tennessee is going to win this game. I think the home field advantage is going to be strong. I don't think Tennessee is going to be looking ahead. They've got a matchup on the road at Georgia next week. Is there a situation where I can envision Tennessee looking over Kentucky a little bit, letting Kentucky hang in there longer than they probably should let them hang in there? Yes, I can see that situation as a possibility. Do I think that's actually going to happen? I don't think so. I believe in head coach Josh Heupel. I think his offense is hitting on all cylinders, and they're doing it without what many people consider their number 1 wide receiver, who's been out for weeks with an injury. So that's pretty phenomenal that they've been able to do that without someone that was considered an integral, vital part of that offensive performance, that they're still doing what they're doing. I do not think Tennessee sleepwalks their way through this game. I do not think they let Kentucky hang in there longer than they should. I do not think they're looking ahead to Georgia. I think at home, with the home fans, and that powerful offense, and a Kentucky offense that I don't think can keep up, I'm going to go with Tennessee in this matchup to move to, 8-0, and set up an absolutely titanic matchup in the SEC next week. Depending on what Ohio State does, probably a number 1 versus number 3 matchup in the SEC East between Georgia and Tennessee at Georgia next week. But for this week, I think Tennessee is going to win this game. Number 4, Michigan. They're at 7-0, coming off a bye week. They're hosting my Michigan State Spartans, who are also coming off a bye week. But it doesn't matter, because it pains me to say this, but my Spartans are not going to win this game. And I'm not even sure this game is going to be that close. Spartan quarterback Peyton Thorne has not played the way he played last year. Their running game isn't as good as it was last year with Kenneth Walker III. Their defense is still atrocious like it was last year. Even in their wins, other than the first 2 this season, Michigan State has not looked good. And they particularly haven't looked good in the losses they've accumulated this season. They're going to lose again Saturday. They're going to lose to Michigan. I don't think Michigan's going to rack up like 400 yards of running like they did against Penn State. But I would not be surprised if this game was over by halftime. Which absolutely hurts my heart to say that. But I would not be surprised if that happened. Michigan's going to win this game. They're going to go to 8-0. And again, we're just going to march along to the inevitable undefeated matchup between Ohio State and Michigan. I just think this is setting up for that to happen. The number 5 team in the nation, the Clemson Tigers, they're 8-0 after that come-from-behind win at home against Syracuse last week. They've got a bye week this week before they are playing Notre Dame on the road next week. Likewise, the number 6 team in the nation, the Alabama Crimson Tide, they also have a bye week before they go to Death Valley to play LSU next Saturday. Number 7, the TCU Horned Frogs, after another come-from-behind victory at home last week against Kansas State. They are on the road this week, taking on the West Virginia Mountaineers. Normally, I would be pretty tempted in this scenario to call an upset, because TCU is coming off a huge emotional come-from-behind win last week at home. They're going on the road to an unranked team. There is an argument to be made that this game could be a pretty big hangover game for TCU, a big letdown game. West Virginia, although I don't think they're good this year, they're not a dumpster fire this year. They're not Virginia Tech this year. They're not Michigan State this year. They're a bit better than that, and it's on the road. It's at Morgantown, which is not the easiest place in college football to play. I wouldn't argue that it's, Columbus, Ohio caliber difficult, but for a team like TCU going in, it can be a hostile environment to play. However, I am going to go with TCU in this matchup. I called them to lose against Oklahoma State. They proved me wrong. I called them to lose against Kansas State. They proved me wrong. I think even if they sleepwalk their way in this game and get behind early, because of what happened in those other 2 games, they're not going to panic. If they get down by 14 points early against West Virginia, they're not going to fret. They're not going to freak out. They're just going to look at each other and go, all right, guys, time to get to work. And they'll probably lead a comeback that will then secure them another come-from-behind victory. I am now a believer in the TCU Horned Frogs this season. Max Duggan as the quarterback, Quentin Johnson is a stud wide receiver, Sonny Dykes is the head coach. They have proven enough to me for me to believe that TCU is the real deal. And I think TCU's got a real shot to finish this deal off, go undefeated, win the Big 12, and possibly get themselves a playoff spot later on this year. It starts this week, though. Again, I would not be totally surprised if TCU was falling behind again in this game, but I don't think that's a big concern. I don't think this is an upset. I think TCU gets the job done in Morgantown. I'm going with the Horned Frogs to go to 8-0 on the year. The number 8 team in the nation, the Oregon Ducks, themselves coming off a big home win last week in a top 10 matchup against UCLA. They are on the road this week against Cal. The same general logic applies to this game that applied to the TCU pick. There is an argument to be made that this is a letdown game, that this is a trap game, that this is a hangover game for Oregon. They get a big win at home. They're back in the top 10. They've rebounded phenomenally after that absolute beatdown they suffered in week 1 against Georgia. They're on the road against a Cal team that's got a somewhat stout defense. Could this be upset city for Oregon and blowing their shot for not just a Pac-12 championship, but also maybe a playoff spot? I don't think so. I've watched Cal once or twice, and I watched their game last week against Washington. They're not good. For as good as their defense might be at holding opponents to fewer points than they would normally score, their offense is atrocious. Even if Oregon stumbles a bit in this game, I don't think Cal's got the defensive goods to completely stop Oregon's offense. I think Oregon's defense is good enough to slow down and completely shut down a bad Cal offense. I think Oregon gets the win here. My only concern in this, and it's a relatively small one, is at some point, I think bad Bo Nix is going to rear its ugly head. Bo Nix has played pretty stupendously since the Oregon loss. I don't think that's the only game, though, that he's going to play poorly in. I don't think it's the game at Cal, but at some point, we're going to see bad Bo Nix rear his ugly head. Whether it's in a Pac-12 championship, whether it's in a playoff game, or whether it's in some rando game like the game against Cal, I don't know. But bad Bo Nix is going to show up, I believe, at some point. It's just a matter of when. And the fact that he's got this streak of good games going, everyone that goes by makes me a tad bit nervous. He played well last week. I think he'll play well enough this week to get past Cal. Go with Oregon to go to 7-1. Number 9, the Oklahoma State Cowboys, themselves coming off a 17-point deficit to win at home last week against Texas. They are on the road against number 22, the Kansas State Wildcats, who were the victims of a comeback last week against TCU. In terms of the stats, Kansas State is better at running the ball than is Oklahoma State. They're both about the same in their rush defense, though. And Oklahoma State is way better than Kansas State when it comes to passing the ball, but they're also way worse than Kansas State when it comes to pass defense. Oklahoma has not had a good pass defense pretty much the whole season, and some teams, like TCU, like nearly Texas Tech, have taken advantage of that. Like Texas, nearly took advantage of that. The biggest concern in this game for Kansas State is their quarterback situation. Last week in the game against TCU, their starting quarterback, Adrian Martinez, started and played the first series, but then was out for the rest of the game. The theory that the commentators came up with was that perhaps he had some sort of nagging injury from the previous week's game that he thought was rested enough and he thought was healed, but it turns out it wasn't and got re-aggravated in that first series, leading him to exit the game. His backup, Will Howard, came in and he led the charge to go up by 18 points against TCU. But then in the third quarter, he got knocked out of the game for a few series. And a freshman third stringer had to come in the game. Will Howard did return to action, but it was too late by that point. TCU had the momentum, and they ended up winning that game. What is the status of each of these quarterbacks going into this game? Well, the news that I was able to find that was updated a couple of hours ago said that Martinez is a game-time decision. And Howard is good to go if he needs to. Apparently, Howard has completely recovered and he had a very good week of practice. So if, in fact, he does need to go, he can. If Howard is in the game, I picture the same thing happening to Kansas State that happened to Kansas a couple of weeks ago, where their backup Jason Bean comes in against TCU, plays out of his mind, and then the next week when he starts, doesn't play well, and they drop that game. If Howard is in this game, I think the same thing is going to happen. If he's not in this game, if Martinez does play, I wonder how effective he's going to be because of a nagging injury that is leaving this a game-time decision whether or not he's going to start. If Martinez does start, in addition, he is more of a running quarterback, which plays into the strength of Oklahoma State's defense, their run defense. Howard was throwing the ball around last week more, which would play into the weakness of Oklahoma State's defense. I think the quarterback situation for Kansas State is troublesome because we don't know if Howard's going to start. If he does, he might be able to take advantage of Oklahoma State's weak pass defense. If Adrian Martinez starts, we don't know how effective he's going to be with an injury, but his game's play style plays right into the hands of Oklahoma State's defense. Even if Howard does start, and supposedly he's all set and ready to go, what happens if he gets sacked and he falls on that shoulder? Does it hold up? If he gets rocked a couple of times, can that injury hold up, or does it get re-aggravated, leading him to exit the game and their third string quarterback to have to come in again? I think the uncertainty behind this game, I think the fact that OSU is completing more of its third down conversions than Kansas State is, I think the fact that OSU still has a prolific offense with Spencer Sanders, all of these are factors in my conclusion that Oklahoma State is going to go on the road and get this win. Go with number 9, the Okie State Cowboys, to win on the road and move to 7-1 and keep pace with TCU for a potential rematch in the Big 12 championship game. The number 10 spot once again sees a tie. This is like the third time the AP voters have done this, and I just find this weird that they do. I don't know why I'm so offended and weirded out that they do this, but it's like, make a decision here. But we've got a tie at number 10 between USC and Wake Forest. They're both 6-1. USC is on the road against Arizona. Arizona is not good at football. USC is good at football. They've had a bye week since their loss to Utah to sit and stew over dropping a game. They're angry. They're going to take it out on the Wildcats. Go with USC. The other number 10, the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, they are also on the road against Louisville. Louisville's a weird team. They've had some good wins and they've had some bad losses. I think Wake Forest under quarterback Sam Hartman has a good enough offense that they'll get the job done. I'm going to go with Wake Forest to win that game. So both teams are going to win. Both teams are going to go to 7-1. The number 12 team in the nation, the UCLA Bruins, coming off that road loss last week at Oregon, are returning to the friendly confines of California to take on Stanford. Stanford is not that good this year. UCLA, I think, is angry about that loss. Their offense played well. They scored 30-some points against Oregon. Their defense, though, could not handle the Oregon offensive attack. Stanford's offense is nowhere near Oregon's offense. That bodes well for UCLA. I think their offense continues to roll. I think their defense tightens up. I think UCLA is going to win this game and get back on track for the Pac-12. Go with number 12, the UCLA Bruins. Number 13, the Penn State Nittany Lions. I've already said I think they're going to lose to the Ohio State Buckeyes in that matchup. Number 14, the Utah Utes. They played last night, and they won that game as I predicted they would against Washington State. So that's another victory for me. Number 15, Ole Miss, coming off a loss on the road last week at LSU. They are 7-1, and they're on the road again this week against Texas A&M. Texas A&M is not good this year. Surprisingly not good this year. They're not as good as LSU. Ole Miss, I think, is going to get back on track this week. I think they get their offense back together. I think they figure out what went wrong against LSU in Death Valley. Go with Ole Miss to hand Texas A&M yet another loss on the season. The number 16 team in the nation, the Syracuse Orange, coming off a strong performance, but a loss last week on the road against the top 10 Clemson team. They return to the Carrier Dome to host Notre Dame. They're about the same when it comes to rushing yards. Syracuse is a little bit better at run defense. Syracuse is a little bit better in passing, and they're a bit better in the run defense. Their defense is more of a turnover-based defense, though. They've got 6 fumble recoveries on the year, 7 picks, as opposed to Notre Dame, that only has 2 fumble recoveries and 1 pick on the year. They're the same in terms of third down conversion percentage. Syracuse, though, last week showed me something. That wasn't a really sharply played first half against Clemson. There was a lot of mistakes and a lot of slow play. Syracuse's defense got a long fumble recovery touchdown against Clemson. They were up 21-10 going into the third quarter in that game before they let up 17 points to Clemson and lost. I think Syracuse is for real. I don't think this is just like a flash in the pan couple of games where they've won. I think Syracuse is the real deal, and I think they're going to be trouble for teams the rest of the way this season. Notre Dame, meanwhile, has rebounded somewhat from those first 2 losses. They're 4-3 on the season. I just don't think they're as good as Syracuse is right now, and it's at Syracuse. And Notre Dame might be slightly looking ahead because they are hosting those Clemson Tigers next week. All of those factors lead me to believe that Syracuse is going to rebound and they're going to win this game. I'm going to go with the Orange to improve to 7-1 on the year and keep pace with some other good teams like Wake Forest in the ACC. Number 17, the Illinois Illini. They are 6-1 on the year. They are on the road at Nebraska. Nebraska has improved since they fired Scott Frost. I don't think anyone can deny that. That doesn't mean, though, that they're a good team, because I don't think that they are. I think Illinois is a good team. I haven't seen much of Illinois play, but I'm willing to roll the dice with them again because I know Nebraska's not that good. So let's go with Illinois to go to 7-1 on the year. Number 18, the LSU Tigers. They have a bye week this week before they host the number 6 team in the nation, the Alabama Crimson Tide, next week in what is likely going to be a pretty big matchup. Number 19, the Kentucky Wildcats. I've already said I believe they are going to lose on the road at Tennessee. The number 20 team in the nation, the Cincinnati Bearcats. They are 6-1. They are on the road against American Athletic Conference opponent Central Florida in an interesting matchup. Central Florida is a lot better at running the ball than is Cincinnati. They're both about the same in run defense. They're both about the same in pass offense. But Cincinnati's a lot better in pass defense than Central Florida is. Central Florida's a little bit better at third down conversions. They both turn the ball over. Central Florida doesn't do it as much as Cincinnati. Cincinnati's defense has gotten 7 interceptions on the year compared to 2 for Central Florida. Cincinnati comes into this game ranked number 2 in the AAC at 3-0 in conference behind Tulane, who's 4-0. Central Florida, meanwhile, comes in number 3 in the AAC at 2-1. Their only loss coming last week, surprisingly, to East Carolina, where Central Florida quarterback, John Reese Plumlee, threw 3 interceptions. That's half of the total interceptions he's thrown all year in that one game. I haven't seen much of Cincinnati, but from what I've seen, they have not looked super impressive. It seems like every time I've turned them on, they're struggling a bit to move the ball. They're struggling to get ahead of a team that they probably should be beating a little more comfortably than they were at the time. Central Florida, meanwhile, the times I've seen them, they've looked very impressive. They laid 70 on Temple the week before their loss against East Carolina. And the week before that, I watched them hang 41 on SMU and destroy them 41-19. When this offense, under head coach Gus Malzahn, is on, they are on. They've got good wide receivers on the outside. Plumlee can run and pass. They run the ball pretty well. 242 a game, 268 passing a game. This game's at Central Florida in the bounce house, as they call it. I'm going to call the upset on this one. I think UCF fixes the problems that they experienced last week against East Carolina. I'm willing to give Plumlee the benefit of the doubt that 3 interception performance was a fluke, and that is not how he's been playing the last few games. I think they get back on track with that offense. I think the crowd is excited. I think they're ready to go for a top 20 matchup, or a matchup against a top 20 team that's in their conference and a team that they need to beat if they want to move into position to make the AAC championship game later this season. Plus, UCF 2 weeks later is playing Tulane on the road. So they've got a chance in these 2 games to make some serious headway in the American Athletic Conference. I think in this game they get the job done. I'm going to call the upset here, and I'm going to say UCF is going to beat Cincinnati, handing them their second loss, and probably, knowing the pollsters, knocking them out of the top 25. Number 21, the North Carolina Tar Heels at 6-1. They are hosting Pitt. I don't know much about North Carolina. The only game I watched part of was their win against Appy State earlier this season. I've seen Pitt play a couple of games this season. I saw them play a tough game against Tennessee, but they've dropped a few games since then. I'm willing to go with North Carolina. They seem like they're on a bit of a roll. Let's go with the Tar Heels to move to 7-1 in that matchup. Number 22, Kansas State. As I've said, I think they are going to lose at home to number 9, Oklahoma State. Number 23, Tulane. They are on a bye this week before they go on the road to Tulsa. Number 24, North Carolina State. They won last night, as I predicted they would, against Virginia Tech, although it was much closer and much more of a frustrating game than I thought it was going to be. Wolfpack. They still got the win. And then rounding out the top 25 is South Carolina. They are home versus Missouri. Missouri played Georgia tough at home a few weeks ago, but then they lost to Florida. And then they only beat Vanderbilt by a field goal, which to me suggests that Missouri ain't too good. So I'm willing to go with South Carolina. I haven't seen South Carolina play this season. I saw a little bit of them against Arkansas when they got beat. I think that game was at home against Arkansas. Other than that, I don't know really anything about them, other than Oklahoma transfer quarterback Spencer Rattler, is their quarterback, and a coach from Oklahoma is the head coach at South Carolina. I'm willing to go with the ranked team, so let's roll with the Gamecocks and see what happens. And that's going to wrap up the Part 2 edition of the picks for Week 9 of the 2022 college football season. Leave me a comment below. Where do you think I've gone right in my picks, and where do you think I've gone wrong in my picks? Also, let me know what picks you're looking forward to watching this week. I'm looking forward to watching Tennessee and Kentucky and that matchup between Cincinnati and UCF. I think that's going to be a fun one to watch. Thanks so much, as always, for tuning in, everyone, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the next video.